Welcome to the Deep Dive Books channel, where we hope you find something valuable every day.
We continue our interpretation of Brian Klaas's Fluke. This is the fifth part of the series. Have you ever thought about the difference between getting things done and completing something fully? To truly complete something, whether it's a project or selling a product, you need reasoning, a plan, manpower and resources, organized implementation, and coordination with various parties. All the way to the final outcome. Along the way, you'll encounter factors you didn't anticipate, your emotions will fluctuate, and you might even feel anxious. But in everyday life, most people rarely follow through on a task from start to finish. When we talk about getting things done, whether it's work or study, we are actually referring to doing the job. Carrying out specific, often repetitive actions, completing intermediate steps. If you're only doing the job, you can fall into the illusion that this is what getting things done means. In fact, you may even feel a sense of accomplishment because these intermediate tasks often have a built-in review mechanism. Students have exams, employees face performance assessments. You think that, as long as you do your job well and pass the review, you are doing things right. But when it comes to the overall result of the big task, you're not responsible for it, or perhaps you've never even considered it. Students go through years of schooling, just collecting credits, seldom worrying about whether a subject will help in their future job or if the decision to offer the course was correct. Employees focus on producing a component with quality and quantity. Design and sales are someone else's responsibility. These controlled, task-oriented scenarios lead us to three beliefs about getting things done. First, there is a right way to do things. Second, your duty is to use willpower and follow the right method. Third, the world should be fair, meaning that rewards should be proportional to effort. These three beliefs stem from a default assumption that things have clear, linear cause and effect relationships. The system's input determines its output, and the output is proportional to the input. Little do we know that only artificial environments, where people are lined up to perform tasks, operate in such a way. In the real world, systems are rarely that simple. Today, let's talk about the science of fully completing tasks. The characteristics of social sciences. Social sciences are complex to the point where you feel powerless. Previously, Bueno de Mesquita, in the Dictator's Handbook. Why Bad Behavior is Almost Always Good Politics, mentioned that authoritarian regimes actually have more resilience in war than democracies. This is because in democracies, if a country loses a war, voters won't stand for it, and the president must step down. But in authoritarian countries, rulers can control the people well, and losing a war doesn't necessarily threaten their rule. Think about it. Right now, Putin's war in Ukraine is clearly not going well. Not only has he failed to deliver on promises to the Russian people, but there are signs of imminent failure. Yet Putin's power remains strong. Klaas notes that, in the late 20th to early 21st century, political science popularized a concept called authoritarian durability, which suggests that authoritarian regimes can survive any crisis. People pointed to Middle Eastern dictators like Ben Ali of Tunisia, Gaddafi of Libya, and Mubarak of Egypt, who were widely criticized but continued to rule for years. Perhaps there's some truth to authoritarianism. While people may lack freedom, the system itself offers stability, providing order. This theory seemed accurate. Until 2010, when a Tunisian street vendor set himself on fire in protest against police brutality outside a government building, sparking the Arab Spring. In just a few months, Ben Ali fled, Mubarak was arrested, and Gaddafi was killed. So what happened to the theory of authoritarian durability? Was the theory wrong? Did scholars overestimate the power of authoritarian regimes, or has the world changed? Perhaps the rise of mobile phones and social media has given the Arab people greater self-organizing abilities, changing the sand pile dynamic and making old theories obsolete? It's hard to say. If someone reads The Dictator's Handbook and thinks, all I have to do is follow this, they may be metaphorically carving the boat to look for the sword. But maybe not. Every theory has its scope. Every model is a limited approximation of the world, and the real world is constantly changing. That's the challenge of social science. We might assume that those who make big decisions, like government officials or corporate executives, must consult with a very professional advisory team. This team would build a sophisticated model, considering numerous influencing factors and feeding in countless quantitative economic indicators, then provide a prediction. Perhaps the advisory team suggests, if you choose option A, there's a 70% chance of success. If you choose option B, the success probability is only 40%. Then, the superior will combine these probabilities with the potential outcomes to make a scientific decision. There are indeed such models. For example, Nate Silver's 538 website uses sophisticated statistical models to predict major events, like predicting the winner of U.S. elections. But generally, decisions aren't made this way. It's not that there's no money for models. The problem is these models have fundamental issues, which limit their effectiveness in practice. For instance, on August 29, 2024, 538 predicted the U.S. election. In 100 simulations, Harris won 58 times, while Trump won 42 times. Would you bet on Harris winning based on that? 58% is not a large number. If Harris loses, Silver could simply claim that a low-probability event occurred, and it wasn't the model's fault. Now, Harris really lost. Furthermore, models don't account for all the key factors. Take the case of the U.S. dropping an atomic bomb on Japan. If 538 had been around, Kyoto would likely have been high on the list for bombing, based on their model. But no model could have predicted that the U.S. Secretary of War had visited Kyoto years earlier. Even if we ignore the chaos theory of complex systems, there are major flaws with models. To distill a system into a model, you must have a thorough understanding of the system. You need to know what factors exist and how they relate. And these factors are typically derived from past behavior. For example, when assessing whether a particular medicine will be effective for a patient, you look at how it worked in similar cases before, implicitly assuming that the current patient is similar to past cases. But what if this patient is completely new and unlike any previous case? How do you quantify that? We've discussed before that economist Frank Knight made a distinction between two types of future risk: risk and uncertainty. Risk refers to events you can foresee. Things that have happened before, like whether a tornado will hit next year. These are quantifiable and have probabilities. Uncertainty, on the other hand, refers to things you can't foresee, like the possibility of war next year. Quantifiable events can be modeled and used to aid decision-making. But unquantifiable, unforeseen events can't be modeled. If you asked a group of economists in 2000 to predict how much time the average Briton would spend on their phone in 2010, they would likely be wrong, because they could only make inferences based on the available data at the time, like the pace of mobile adoption. They could never have predicted the advent of the smartphone, which completely changed the way people use phones. In fact, we not only struggle to imagine the future, but we also know very little about the present, Klaas says. Yet all social scientists know a secret that we rarely discuss openly. Even our best minds don't really understand how our social world works. Since there aren't even appropriate models, scientific decision-making for major tasks becomes an illusion. There's a story about a decision scientist, a professor at Columbia University, who was hesitating whether to switch jobs to Harvard. His friend suggested, "Why don't you calculate the utility of staying versus going to Harvard, multiply by the probabilities, and make a scientific decision? Isn't that what you always talk about?" The decision scientist replied, "Please, I'm talking about serious matters here." The reality is that rational choice theory solves only a limited set of problems. In fact, most of life is about going with the flow. Even when we face major decisions, we rarely make models to calculate probabilities. So, how do we decide? Nobel laureate Robert Shiller has a famous concept called narrative economics. He says that people often make decisions not based on rational choices, but on the stories they believe in. Simply put, once you buy into a story, you act according to that story. For instance, before the 2008 financial crisis, the prevailing story was that home prices always rise, much like how people in China once talked about essential housing needs. At that time, discussing risk or math didn't matter. People believed that story. Conversely, if the economy is weak and people lack confidence, that's another story. Talking about math won't change anything. Similarly, in the late 1990s to early 2000s, people discussed the new economy, the digital and information technology revolution. Investment during this period was like the current AI wave. Venture capitalists didn't rely on precise predictions, because no one knew what the future would look like. They just had to tell a good story, and it might become a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you believe Bitcoin is like gold, you'll treat it as an important investment asset. If you believe in green energy, you might endure 10 years of poor returns to install solar panels in your home. According to Shiller's narrative economics, instead of focusing on quantitative metrics, it's better to examine what stories are currently popular in the media and on social networks. For governments, it's more effective to create a new story that people will believe in, rather than offering policies that don't move anyone. So, decision-making doesn't usually rely on social sciences. And social scientists are aware of this. A 2020 large-scale study illustrates this well. Researchers selected 5,000 children from so-called vulnerable families, typically those born to unmarried parents. These children's families often had unstable conditions and limited financial resources. The study tracked these children over time, visiting them periodically to collect not just quantitative data, but also to conduct psychological assessments. The data collected from these children at ages 1, 3, 5, and 9 included academic performance, resilience, material conditions, whether they were evicted due to unpaid rent, whether their parents lost jobs, and so on, with all data being made available to researchers. When the children turned 15, the researchers didn't release the data immediately. Instead, they held a challenge, asking research teams worldwide to predict how these children would fare at 15, based on their earlier data. 160 teams participated, each using their own models to make precise predictions. Imagine the situation. There's a saying in China. You can see how a person will turn out by the age of 3. This makes many parents anxious, wondering if their child's lack of interest in learning at age 4 or 5 means they'll never succeed academically. If these worries were justified, at least one of these research teams should have been able to successfully predict the children's academic outcomes at age 15. But the results? All 160 teams performed poorly. Even the best teams' predictions were no better than random guesses. So the good news is, you can't predict the future at age 3, so don't worry. But the bad news is, social science truly can't provide reliable predictions. Klaas notes that, in the past decade, less than 1% of papers in major journals in economics, political science, and sociology have attempted to make predictions. The rest focus only on studying simple cause and effect relationships. If you ask me what impact parental layoffs have on children, I can certainly give you an answer based on a large-scale statistical analysis. But the impact of this factor is likely to be very small. The reality is that each individual is influenced by countless factors, so a specific factor in your mind may not matter much to them. If a social science study provides a cause and effect relationship, we need to understand that it has only limited practical value for you. This means there's no practical scientific method to tell you how to complete a task from start to finish and ensure success. What we have are statements about causal relationships that are like intuition, but you can never know exactly how much impact these relationships have. This world is always shaped by human action, always requiring risk-taking, and always full of surprises. That's all for today. In the next part, we'll discuss the beauty of disorder.
If you feel there is value in this, please like, subscribe to this channel, and leave your thoughts or suggestions in the comments section. Let's grow together and read more good books.